Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Mary Jane and I handle event and marketing at Singapore FinTech Association. Today we are presenting Elevating Your Communication Strategy in 2022, presented by Emma Pickering, Head of Singapore at Cognito, and is moderated by Shu Fen, Singapore FinTech Association Head of Partnership. So just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel. It will be brought up during the presentation, and we will also have time for a Q&A segment at the end. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to Emma and Shu Fen.
Thank you, MJ. So welcome everybody to SFA's last webinar for the year. So as we wind down for the year, we thought that we will talk about FinTech in a different angle about communications. So 2021 has been sort of, a ride for some of us. Most of us maybe cannot wait for it to be over, but I hope that all of us are, looking forward to 2022 and raring to go. So we thought we will approach this session in a sort of a fun way with Emma, and we'll look at the best and the worst of 2021 and take some learnings and insights as we move towards 2022. So I believe that no good product can go to market without being fronted by a good, effective communication strategy and plan. And it takes skill and expertise to craft a good strategy, a good plan, and go the message for the best impact. So we have here with me Emma, Head of Cognito Singapore, to share with us her insights, experience, and most importantly, use cases. Cognito is an integrated PR and comms agency with key clients in big tech, fintech, and retail finance. So importantly, Cognito has worked with us recently in Singapore, and he being the official PR partner for Singapore FinTech Festival, and SFA's trusted PR partner. So before I hand it over to her, I just want to remind you guys, this is we want to make this session as engaging as possible. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll pick them up, and we'll try and answer it in the latter half of the presentation. So over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Shu Fen, for that wonderful introduction, and hello and good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to start sharing my screen, so hopefully that is seamless. Let's do this. Okay, so thank you again for joining us today. As Shu Fen said, it's kind of unbelievable that we're here already at the end of 2021, and I'm already talking to you about planning for 2022. I'm not sure where the year has gone. It's been a roller coaster, a very exciting year, and a very busy year for a lot of us as well. So during today's session, what I really want to talk you through with some live examples is my top tips for elevating your communication strategy in 2022. And when I talk about communication strategy, what I'm saying here is mostly your public relations strategy, but this parts of what we'll go through today will also be applicable to your marketing strategy as well. So what I want to do today is make it as interactive as possible, as Shu Fen said, but also to give you some actual top tips and practical things to do that you can take away from this session. So rather than just talking you through it, I'm going to give you kind of hints, tips, things you can do in order to elevate your communication strategy for next year. So as I'm sure many of you have experienced, 2021 has been a very busy, very exciting year for Singapore's fintech community. And with that as our basis, I think the only way is up in 2022. So the last few weeks of the year for Cognito, my colleagues in our offices across the world, normally represents a very good time to take stock of the communications efforts in 2021, and then look forward and start planning for the year. So you essentially start things on the right note, starting strong, and getting your company, your business, the recognition it deserves next year. So without further ado, I'm going to kick off. Before we go into the top tips, my first slide for you today is to review some of the 2021 trends. So firstly, let's take a look at the trends, themes, what we saw from fintech firms' PR efforts in 2021. First and foremost, COVID. I cannot remember the last time I wrote a piece of content, apart from maybe some sort of random announcements or fundraisings, that did not include the words COVID somewhere in there. It has been a huge disruptor and a huge, accelerator for our industry last year. A lot of you may not have foreseen that the businesses you have today would be shaped in such a manner by the events of the last 2 years as well. And, we don't know what 2022 holds. I've stopped predicting based on the last couple of years. But what it really means is it's been a huge driver of growth for a lot of fintechs. And that means we can't help but talk about it. It's now an integral part of the lexicon, of our fabric, of what we do, how we're driven, and also how consumers and our clients are actually responding to what we're doing in the market. So a lot of businesses will have been driven by things like consumer demand for more digital finance, digital banking, digital services in that way that 2 years ago would have been unthinkable in many situations. Second theme, again, COVID. I mean, I couldn't fill really 3 themes without 2 being COVID. But again, other 2021 trends that we're seeing, and these are actually very strongly linked to some of the trends we saw at Singapore FinTech Festival as well. So Web 3.0, moving companies out of the Web 2.0 space into the Web 3.0 has been a key theme for a lot of our clients and a lot of clients in the market as well. Embedded finance, and also the growth of embedded finance experience. So finance being in pretty much everything we do, how we engage with brands, whether we realize it or not. A really good example of this is Grab's recent listing. Grab is, we don't really think of it as finance anymore. It's sort of just this multi-platform we live our lives on. We do so much in Singapore and across the region on it that we've almost forgotten that there's finance involved in the back end of that. Third is disruption as well. So we're seeing lots of disruptive players coming into the market, challenging the status quo, challenging the banks, challenging established processes as well. A lot of this is COVID driven, but also, a lot of these businesses were conceived before COVID, but have had to adapt, change, and are facing new challenges or new areas of opportunity. And fundraising too. So I've got some stats on the next slide I'll go on to, but more than ever, we're seeing large rounds across Singapore, across the region at the moment, which is very interesting. I think we saw quite an interesting period for the market in 2020 where investors, travel shut down, investors suddenly went on hiatus because they weren't willing to part with their money if they couldn't physically come and meet someone as they used to do, and look through the business and meet that founder and understand who they were putting money into. But as we've grown more used to communicating, just as I am now with you over Zoom, over Teams, whatever platform you're using, investors have started coming back and that appetite has reemerged. And the pandemic has obviously been too long that we couldn't hold off investing any longer or making those moves. So that plus the disruption that COVID has caused has given rise to some really, really monumental funding rounds this year. So those are the kind of 2021 trends that we're seeing. But then what do we expect from 2022? So if last year was any indication, next year is going to be an absolutely fantastic year for Singapore's fintech community and the community across the region as well. But as I touched on, with more funding flowing in, more companies are starting up, there's much more competition and a lot of companies putting a lot of spend behind their marketing, behind their PR objectives and their growth trajectory as well. So looking at some stats from EFT, in November, they reported that Refinitiv, so the data analytics group, said there had been 80 fintech deals worth $3 billion in 2021. That's more than what was raised in 2020 and 2019 combined. So if we take that as our benchmark and our growth point for 2022, we're looking at a lot of money flowing into the industry. As we know, also Southeast Asia has been really one of the beneficiaries of a slowdown in doing business in China as Hong Kong remains closed to travel and some inward investment as well. Crackdowns on crypto in those markets have meant that companies are seeing Singapore and Southeast Asia as a very natural home for themselves as well and a natural base. So we'll start to see more companies setting up here. And here at Cognito, we're already seeing that the number of clients who are in decentralized finance, really interesting boundary pushing industries coming to us as new entrants into the market, even over the last sort of 3 months, has been astounding, really. And then we also, continue to see strong consumer demand, particularly around banking, mobile payments, any of those digital finance pieces we talked about earlier, as as companies bring on board people who were previously underserved and unbanked as well into the mix. But if you take all of that into account, really, the question we're here to help you with today is, as a company, then how do I stand out? How do we stand out if there is so much noise in the market and there is going to be more competition? So that's where the New Year's resolutions come in. It's always good to set them. And what I'm going to do today is the next few slides will take you through 5 individual New Year's resolutions to have a think about and apply back to your business. So my first is audit your social channels. So if your LinkedIn's looking a little unloved, if your Facebook's lacking some friends, it's time to take a look at your social media and sort it out, because really your social channels say more about your company than you realize. If you've ever applied for a job, if you've ever wanted to find out what a company does, a very, very natural thing now is, rather than go to their website, is go to their LinkedIn. See what the company's saying about themselves. Who are the employees? Where are they based? Tells you more about your company than you realize. So you almost have to think of it as your internet storefront in addition to your website. It's what most people will pass by or will see at first glance and make an assessment of you in some ways. Social media is also a wonderful thing for offering another avenue for content, getting viewpoints out there around interesting industry goings on, connecting with people. So if your social channels are looking a little unloved, there's a few things you can do. Number 1, create a plan. Big fan of plans. I wouldn't be working in an agency if I didn't like a plan, but sit down, look at the next 6 months for you as your company, even 3 months if the next 6 months is sort of unheard of. What are the significant moments coming up for you next year? Are you planning any funding rounds? Are you making some key hires? Do you have any partnerships you're going to be announcing as well? But really start to create almost a map of your social, of your announcements and things coming out next year. And then start to think about, well, how can we promote these across social media? Would it be worth writing a long form post, a sort of blog post on a topic that's of interest or relevant to there? Or do I need to come up with short form posts to tie in with announcements, to make sure people are hearing news from the company as well, and that we're keeping that social media much more updated? So coming up with a calendar like that means you can populate it as you go throughout the year. You can, as new things come into the business, you can plot those into the months, but aiming for at least a few posts per month if you can, to make sure that your social channels are looking loved and no longer neglected, is really, really beneficial for people who are looking into your company or looking to work with you. And secondly, considering auditing or actually updating your channels to make sure you're following the people who matter and that they're following you as well. So what we hope is, by creating more relevant content, by pushing out posts, blog posts, that more of these people who you want to engage with will actually start to follow you or sit up, take notice and engage with you in that sense. But also, are you following the right companies, industry leaders? What about new prospects? If you're touting for business from someone, are you following them on LinkedIn? Are you engaging with what they're posting? Are you, LinkedIn actually with the senior people and the decision makers that you're working with as well? So thinking of social media as underpinning what you do, rather than being something you do in isolation or you just sort of gently push to the side and never look at again. And finally, one of my top tips as well. So social media should really no longer be considered to be free media in that sense. Yes, you can get great organic traction from some posts, especially if you've got a good standing network anyway. But really looking into some of the LinkedIn tools, and they're very, very easy to access through the back end of LinkedIn, can really help you to put some money behind posts, to boost them so that they get seen by the right people. You can tailor your audience. We actually ran a lead gen campaign recently where we talked about some of the top tips and the sort of similar things I'm talking about today. And we asked those people who wanted to download our kind of booklet to give us their email address. And for us, that's a very natural way of doing some lead generation as well, and giving us some sales targets to follow up on. So we were able to populate Salesforce off the back of what we had done with LinkedIn. And that's not a costly campaign. By putting a couple of $1,000s, something behind this, you can start to really make sure your content is hitting the right people, or you're getting the details of those people that you also need to be engaging with. So social channels are absolutely key. Please do not forget about them as part of your communications matrix. But those are really some good tips to kind of get you started. LinkedIn backend are very, very helpful guides on how to do all of this as well, and some very good articles out there on LinkedIn best practice too. Okay, and something very, very dear to my heart, but our second New Year's comms resolution would be to review your PR strategy. So whether you had a very successful year in terms of your communications, or whether actually you felt like announcements that you put out weren't getting the traction that you hoped or didn't really make the impact, then it's maybe time to rethink your PR strategy and relook your PR program as well. So the first point here, the first kind of piece of practical advice, and I'm going to reference this several times throughout the rest of the presentation, so please hear me out. Map your audiences. Who is it you're trying to reach? Is it, who are your new prospects? Who are the people you want to bring on board as new talent? What industries, what verticals do you need to expand into in order to grow your business next year? Because once you've thought about your audiences, you can really think about the content that would work for them. So maybe if you're looking to recruit heavily next year, maybe traditional media isn't actually the best way forward. Maybe a LinkedIn campaign is actually quite a good way of targeting those people. But what if you needed to, say, reach the education sector next year? Can you look into publications that cover education, journalists who cover education as well, and start to think how your content or what you're putting out could actually be relevant for those audiences? So you need to look at the target audiences and essentially mix and match them with the publications, the channels, and also the messaging that will matter to them and will resonate. So it's really important when we look at messaging that if you're targeting the education sector, are you speaking in a way that decision makers in that industry would understand? Are they going to know how you can help them from the content that you're putting out as well? And then my advice is to go back to that lovely social calendar you've put together, look at those announcements, look at those themes, and work out not only how they can apply across social, but how they can apply across traditional media as well, or who you might need to target in order to get those messages across. And also remembering that different mediums actually work well for different types of content. So a lot of what I get at the moment from clients is, we've moved offices, can we write a press release about it? And my advice to them is, so a press release is always something that we want to use when something is going to grab a journalist's attention and make a headline. And quite often what we find with clients is that, yes, internal things are extremely, extremely important to you, but that doesn't always mean that they'll be important externally as well. So kind of key pieces of advice is, don't assume that one medium will work for all of your news or announcements as well. So maybe what we advised our client was that actually their office move would be a great LinkedIn post. Take some shots of the office, it's a really nice shop house, write up some text underneath it, get people to engage with it that way, because otherwise we would be spending time with them writing a press release, which would actually achieve no pickup and actually not really reach the audiences that they wanted to reach as well. So you've got things like press releases, bylined articles, which are essentially a blog post, a more formal blog post that allows you to talk about a topic that's close to your heart, or to really get to grips with, an interesting topic. And things like channels, you've got your broadcast. Is it more relevant that actually you go on Money FM and talk about something that's important to your business or that you're doing? Or actually, is it more suited to the Straits Times? Or finally, if you've launched a RegTech firm recently, do you actually need to go to Asia Asset Management, Asia Regulation Asia, and talk to these specialist trade media, because that's where your audience will come from as well. So very important. And also planning ahead. In the same way that you plan your social calendar as well, spending time to plan your PR calendar strategy in 3 or 6 month cycles is always great. We would always say leave a bit of leeway in case interesting news breaks happen, things that you want to comment on, interesting market developments come up. But really, by mapping this out early on, you can save yourself a lot of work and think really holistically about who you're trying to target and what you're going to target them with. So our third comms resolution is to refresh your messaging. And what I mean when I say messaging is the way your company is described, both internally, both externally, verbally, or in writing as well. So messaging is incredibly important. Having a consistent message or a consistent way of describing your organization, what it does, its goals, its aims, objectives, means that the more it's repeated to other people, both internally and externally, the more it sticks and the more the company becomes known for that message. So, as she then introduced Cognito at the beginning, Cognito is a fully integrated communications agency specializing in financial services, big tech, and FinTech. But if you'd asked me 20 years ago, I would have said Cognito is a public relations agency helping clients with newspaper journalist relations in the technology sector. We've come a long way from that initial message. And so messaging is something that's quite fluid. It evolves over time. In our world, in the fintech world, it probably needs to be looked at each year as your company evolves, expands into different markets, refreshes its offering, products, etc. as well. So messaging, it's good to sit down, basically look at what your messaging is right now and look at whether that needs to change, whether it still adequately describes what you do. Is it clear cut across your organization, or do you have a global message within your company that actually might need to be flexed a little bit to suit the Asian market that you're in as well? And sometimes with clients, we sit down and we will spend a whole day working through their messaging. It can be quite a long process, particularly if a company is changing category, if they're rebranding. All of this can get really in depth. But what I wanted to say to you today, you don't need to go through that process. You can do a more of a DIY version internally. So I would gather your key stakeholders in a room together, get your company's message up and say, actually, does this represent us? Is it easy to understand both internally and externally? Does it feel out of date? Is it too jargony for the people we're trying to reach as well? And then I would map your audiences. You've heard me say that a couple of times now, but it's going to keep coming up. And look at how your messaging, does it work for those audiences? Do we need to change it as well? Does it need to flex depending on the audience? So going back to the education sector example, do your clients in the education vertical need to have a slightly different message to your clients in the regulation vertical, for example? And one way of doing this, if you go online, if you Google Message House, you will find loads of really, really helpful resources online that will enable you to build out something called a messaging house, which is a kind of on a page way of looking at your messaging, giving you a top line message and backing it up with key supporting proof points. So really, having clear and easy to understand messaging is an extremely helpful thing. And I would advise to revisit that really on an annual basis to make sure that the messaging you set is still relevant for what your business is doing at that point. All right, and upskilling your media interview technique. So interviews with journalists, panel sessions like this, webinars, they should all be prepared for. I often say to clients, it's the old saying, fail to prepare, prepare to fail. If you do not prep for these things, you will not give the best version of your confident self and your company in a media interview. And the preparation really starts well before actually you should even have an interview on the horizon. So if you've never been through media training or looked into it before, then 2022 should absolutely be your year for it. What we mean by media training is a sort of session that helps you to get your key messages across clearly. So we've just talked about those messages. How do we articulate them in the context of an interview or a live session, as well as preparing you to deal with potentially difficult questions from journalists? We're very lucky in Singapore and across Asia that by and large, a lot of our journalists and media targets are actually really nice, very open to working with you. They'll do very helpful things like send you questions in advance of an interview. That's absolutely not my experience in Europe and in the UK. It's a very, very different environment, and you tend to get curveball questions thrown at you. So I've sat in Financial Times interviews in London with my clients having very, very difficult questions asked of them, seeing them flounder, and then me having to step in and say, you need to stop that line of questioning, or having to bail my client out as well. So while we have nice media here, by and large, it still pays to make sure that your media interview skills are really, really up to par. So there's a couple of things you can do here. Firstly is to look out for any media trainers or to pay for a session in that sense. But if budget is an issue, there are loads of amazing online resources you can use. Lots of PR agencies have put up media training guides. There are links to videos of best media interviews and the worst media interviews as well. So you can go online and you can start to see some of this guidance, these resources. And by watching these videos, you'll quickly realize what you do want to do in an interview and what you don't want to do in an interview. So if you're looking, actually, there's far more of the worst media training videos out there. It's quite hard to find the best, but Somebody I would recommend to go and watch some videos of is a little bit controversial now, but some Jack Ma interviews from about 5-6 years ago. Very, very good interviewee, very confident speaker, gets his key messages across very clearly. On the flip side, have a look at a BBC interview, and I'll make this link available. I'll send it over to Shufen and Mary Jane afterwards. There are some great interviews involving Research and Motion and BlackBerry execs from about 4 or 5 years ago, where they're being grilled on some quite difficult questions, and you'll see that they don't come out of it particularly well. Now, we want to avoid that as much as possible. So as well as having a look at all those resources online, I've got a few top tips for interview preparation, which can also be used for your webinars, any conferences you might do, any panel sessions, important meetings as well. When I'm in board meetings, I sometimes crack out some of my media training experience as well in order to answer difficult questions. So the first is to spend time preparing. If you have an interview coming up for journalists, please read the publication that the journalist writes for. Familiarize yourself with how the publication writes, their tone of voice, the sorts of questions that they're asking their spokespeople as well. And also understand what their audience needs. So it's always worth noting that there'll be a big difference, for example, between an interview with Business Times and, let's say, an interview with a very technical trade publication. The level of technical detail that you can go into will differ, the level of jargon that will be understood. And those publications both have different outcomes and requirements. Business Times wants to sell to the masses, get lots of click-throughs, and sell advertising space as well, whereas the trade press that you deal with may, they want to really get deep into the heart of some very, very technical issues as well. It's not so much about the mass sales. And then think about your key messages as well. So we just went through that message house. We can do a similar sort of messaging exercise when it comes to each interview. If you left that interview and the journalist only remembered one thing about it, what is the one thing you would want them to know or to get across? That is your key message for that interview. You can have that for the interview. You can have a key message for each question as well, but almost setting up and writing down the points you'd like to get across based on the questions that you are being asked is absolutely key. You can have them, just as I'm doing, a lot of interviews now are virtual. So I've got my notebook here. You can't see that, but I can write down some of the key points that I want to put forward and leave you with today on this. You can do the same in a media interview situation. And the final thing as well is to anticipate the difficult questions. So think in advance, what is the worst question a journalist could ask me? Is there something that's gone on recently in the company that has been made public that a journalist might touch on? Is there a problem in my industry at the moment? Say I'm in crypto and I was being interviewed yesterday or today after the price crash at the weekend. What would my key message be around that? What would I want to put across? So always being prepared and thinking, giving some time in advance to think about those difficult questions is absolutely key, because it will really help you in the long run. And all of these, basically, that preparation helps you to be clear, helps you to be confident in your answers, and it also helps you to stay in control of the interview. So really, if I had, a little bit of money and that was it for my marketing and PR budget for the rest of the year, I would put it towards media training, no doubt. These skills come through in everyday life, not just in your media training, in media interviews as well. And finally, knowing what to do in a crisis. So we never think, or we never want to think, that a crisis will happen to us. But when it does, what we see from organizations is that they are completely unprepared for what they need to say to their audiences, whether those are your stakeholders and partners, your employees, or the general public as well. And quite often we find with clients, there's a real reluctance to actually kind of come out and deal with the crisis. You sort of want it patted down as quickly as possible. Now, the best crisis management you won't hear about, because we've managed to keep it out of the headlines before it even got there. But for example, I've spent 2 years working with a listed construction company in London around a huge ongoing crisis that they had. And these things can take time, they can suck time, money, they can cost people their jobs. So when it comes to crisis, always being prepared from a communications point of view is absolutely key. So a few things we do with clients is we run crisis preparedness sessions. So we go in and say, what are the threats to your business? what do we need to prepare for? Are there scenarios that could happen? What if one of your founders leaves? What if there's a mass, a load of employees are poached by another company, which is not beyond the realms of possibility at the moment. But we train them and we create something called a playbook. Crisis playbooks, a lot of companies sort of make the crisis playbook, put it away on the shelf and never use it again. But like your messaging, it's something that needs to come out every year, be dusted off, understand what the threats are to your business. And, that playbook is instrumental. And in a couple of minutes, I'll go into exactly what that should contain. But if you are looking to do some crisis preparedness internally, first of all, a SWOT analysis is great. You should do this regularly for your business anyway, hopefully. But if there's anything external or internal that could be a potential threat to your business in the next 3 to 6 months, what is it? Is it, potentially a disgruntled employee? I've seen lots of companies have problems with disgruntled employees going to the media about something or selling a story or raising awareness of something. Is it something like a supply chain ransomware attack that you have very little control over, but you may still need to prepare your approach to it as well? Then you know what threats you will need to respond to. Then secondly, once you've identified the threats, it's absolutely key to look at the audiences that could be impacted. So internally, quite a lot of companies forget about their employees when it comes to crisis communications, but employees always need to know at the same time any public facing statements go out in a crisis situation, because they are so important to your business. How about your board? How about your investors, your partners? And when it comes to external, how about your customers and the general public as well? How would the threats affect them if they were to come to life? And how would you communicate to these audiences as well? Employees, you may have Slack, you may have a town hall, you may go out with a mass email. But for your board, you'll need to kind of write a letter, email them, have something much more formal that goes out to them in order to, in the face of a crisis. And so what this comes down to is the creation of the playbook. So once you know the threats, you know the audiences and how these threats might affect them, you can create a playbook or a crisis process document. You will know who is in charge in the event of a crisis. You can even work up draft statements. I've done this with clients before, and we work up the basis of statements to go to the media, to customers, to the board. In the event that a crisis happens, we can fill in the details. We sometimes plot specific scenarios and give actually a statement for a specific scenario as well. And then we'll know in that crisis playbook, we'll know who is going to actually sign off that statement, who's our first point of contact, who liaises with the CEO on the sign off. So really, a crisis playbook, it can contain pre-written documents, but sometimes we can't prepare for those crises. So even having a sort of course of action, a flowchart, what happens, to identify what happens when a crisis breaks and who should be communicated to by whom is incredibly important. So while sometimes it's tempting to bury our heads in the sand and think, oh, this will never happen to us, it's good as you work through your planning for next year to really kind of face up to the potential threats to your business and look at how you might be able to respond to them. In the event of a crisis which has reputational damage, I would always advise to bring in the professionals, but there is work that you can do upfront to smooth any processes should the worst happen. All right, so those were essentially our 5 New Year's communications resolutions. I think over last year, I've seen clients get a lot more sophisticated in what they require on the communications front, but at the end of the day, we do that with all of our clients, whether they are huge asset managers, whether they are small startups going through, a seed or a Series A round as well. My advice to you is the same. Just the level of budget or time you might be able to put towards it is different. But as I said, there are loads and loads of free resources out there that can help you and, upskill you in this area. But if I can leave you with 3 key things today, your communication strategy and looking at it holistically for 2022 will help you to understand what the opportunities are and be ready to take advantage of them before your business. So if you know you have a funding announcement coming out next year. By preparing for that in advance, by looking at the media, the audiences, etc., you're more ready to take advantage or to leverage that opportunity to communicate externally with your audiences. Knowing that there are tips, tricks, and techniques to make your communication strategy effective. So I hope I've given you some practical ones today as well. And I know there'll be some questions afterwards and we can delve into those in a little more details. And also being prepared for the worst, just in case. Please always, as we said on that crisis slide, it's like the media training. If you think of the worst case scenario, then you're always better prepared for it in the long run. All right, and that concludes the presentation today. So I'll stop sharing and I'll hand over to Shufen.
Thank you for that. Thank you for your sharing and the insights. Be prepared for the worst and hope for the best. It's kind of like advice for life, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty much.
So I just wanted to do like a quick recap of your tips and hacks, which I captured. Always make a plan, grab headlines, always map your audience. Knowing the audience is really important. Consistency of messaging, no jargons, and we know we're in an industry of jargons and abbreviations. Always important to sort of think from the user point of view, right? Clear proof points for your messages. Interview techniques, the best is to watch interviews of the greats, right? Learn from the best. Always focus on that one thing or that takeaway. I think that's really good advice in general for communications. Crisis management and anticipate threats, and always have a playbook. So I want to just ask a few questions of my own and what I received. We also did a poll pre-webinar, and I want to get an opportunity to ask that question, those set of questions as well. And while I go through that, if you have any questions, please feel free to PM me or drop it into the Q&A box, and then we'll pick them up for answering. So, question, Emma. You talked about these. You talked about messaging. You talked about having a plan. Does timing matter? How much does timing matter? So, if you had a product that you had planned to launch during this period on a certain date, what are the factors to consider when you would shift that product launch date because of what's happening, to the industry, certain announcements that are made? How much does timing matter in this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's something we negotiate back and forth with our clients on a lot, because quite often clients will have an internal deadline or something internally that they're working towards, but you're not always aware. So timing matters a lot. For example, common mistakes we see from clients are wanting to release news on a Friday. There is no worse day than a Friday to get your news out there, because readership of publications just drops. There's very little engagement in LinkedIn. Oh, there's getting to be more, because I think a lot of people are using LinkedIn like Facebook now, but it's lower engagement on pieces like that. You've got to think about timing of big events and holidays as well. So if there's a huge conference coming up and actually that a lot of information will come out of that conference already, then potentially swamp media, even to the point where media aren't actually at their desks because they're at the conference. That makes a huge difference. And also we're coming to an interesting point now where we essentially say to clients, after about the 15th of December, we don't advise getting news out, because people are going on holiday. In a lot of cases in Singapore, they're leaving the country.
Yep.
Appetite for big news is a bit lower as well. And then we also have to be mindful in the same way around Chinese New Year, actually. So timing comes into play a lot. We can't always know what our competitors are going to do. I've had instances where we've gone out with a product launch for a client and a competitor has launched on the same day, or worst of all, they've launched the day before. And then your mind share is taken up by that competitor's announcement as well. But as much as you can, think of the external pieces rather than just being driven by an internal need. And an advisor or doing your research can help you to push back internally if there is an issue with the timing that has been suggested.
That's useful to know. So I have a question, and this came from the community. We talk about crisis management. It's always good to be prepared, but it's quite a challenge to, be prepared for all scenarios. So if you, based on your experience, maybe is there a worst comms or PR mistake that you've seen, and what learnings we can take from that?
Yes, absolutely. I will not name names because when it comes to crisis, nobody likes to be kind of hauled over the coals on that. The worst mistake I've seen even is when the CEO, there's a crisis happening. In this case, it was closure of offices that I was working with a client on. They were closing 2 or 3 of their regional offices. And a journalist got in touch, and the CEO went ahead and just spoke to the journalist and gave her a statement, which was not the statement we as their PR agency would want to be put out there. And what we then had to do was we had to do some crisis management around that, but also the crisis as a whole. So quite often, by jumping the gun and wanting to be responsive to media and wanting to be transparent and be out there, which are all great things, people can dig themselves quite a deep hole. Mm-hmm. So I'd always say, if a crisis happens and the media start knocking on your door, in some cases I've had them turn up at people's doorsteps, please send them away if that happens. Please regroup internally on your statement to the media, your approach to the media, before you go out and you put anything on your LinkedIn or you say it directly to a journalist. If you ask, I think, PR professionals, that is the one thing that makes you do a massive facepalm, which is when your spokesperson has gone rogue, essentially. So don't go rogue. Come back, think about it, plan. There's always time to do some planning and some strategizing, even in a crisis situation.
Okay, don't go rogue. So
don't go rogue.
Don't go rogue. That's the tip. So along the same line, I'm picking up questions like, is there a particular company whose communications, you don't have to name the company, let's keep it anonymous. Is there something in the comms, stuff that you see that you like or dislike the most?
I think with the media training videos, sometimes it's harder to say the things I dislike. Sometimes, not naming names, of course, but sometimes the larger a company gets, the more disjointed their communications becomes. And what you get is a situation where different departments in the organization are just pumping out loads and loads of press releases on things that aren't actually newsworthy. And what you get then is you start to annoy the media, because as a PR agency, we're then having to send all of these announcements to the media, and we know that they won't be of interest. Journalist relationships are hard fought. So we want to give them content we know is going to actually give them the headlines. If you think about their, what a journalist wants to do, they want to be seen to write great stories. So there's a respect and an authority piece as well, but they also have to sell. You have to get click-throughs. So as we touched on earlier, some of that news that companies consider to be internal, and the requirement to get that out externally can actually do more harm than good. And I'd say a second point on this as well is what companies do really well, what I've seen companies in Singapore and the region do well, is even when they're a global company, we work with somebody internally, whether it's a comms manager, whether it's one of their spokespeople, who will turn around and say to global team, we can't send this out here. It's too US focused. It's not regional enough. We need to think about getting more regional announcements and generating announcements here, rather than just using content that comes down from global, whether that's US or Europe. So I love it when a client says to me, we won't do that. We're going to work with the US, with Europe, to actually regionalize press releases and regionalize communications.
I see. So don't go rogue, don't flood, keep it relevant, right?
Correct.
Okay, I hope we've answered that question. So the other question is from Johnny: is having bad publicity considered better than no publicity at all?
Oh, Johnny, that's
everyone always ask.
That is an interesting one. That is an interesting question. I'm quite conservative when it comes to some of the publicity that we do. And I think, having been burned by bad publicity for clients in London, where it really went nuclear, is that good publicity is always what we want to aim for. If we can keep the bad away from the media, then that's great, because what happens is, even then in future, when you have good news, journalists have long memories, the publication has long memories, and you will find the bad news still referenced in the good news. So even if you go ahead and, the company I was referring to earlier, where a couple of offices were shut down, even if then they open a new office in another country, the media will always remember about the offices they closed down as well, and that will always get noticed in the article. So you struggle sometimes to get the cut through with the good if there has been a lot of bad publicity.
Yeah, stories live forever online.
And also, in the UK, we'd say, yesterday's news was today's fish and chip wrapping paper. But because we don't deal with so much with print anymore, you're right, the digital lives forever. It's hardwired into the internet then.
Yeah, that's true. So if we flip it around, enough about bad publicity and, negative news, any favorite PR moments? I mean, we talked about recapping 2021 and looking forward to 2022. Any really good PR stunts and moments that you've witnessed in the year that you can share?
Absolutely. So I think in the last couple of years, we've seen fewer stunts almost because, we've largely been at home in a digital environment. But in terms of really great PR news, seeing Grab list this last week has been fantastic, I think, for Southeast Asian FinTech companies, really, really building the profile. For a lot of companies we deal with in the US or clients we deal with in the US, there's very low awareness actually of companies who are just huge in terms of scale, region, reach. And it's really nice to see companies from this region making the headlines elsewhere as well, which was great. I am biased, but Singapore FinTech Festival is always a highlight for me because I love to see people in conversation about the topics that are so relevant to our market today. I would love, it'd be great to be back there in person and, doing all of that networking in real life as well. But for me, that's always a real highlight to see the community come together and to see lots of announcements being made around really key topics at those points.
Yeah, I think we all hope so. Hopefully 2022, we get more physical opportunities. Yes, fingers, toes crossed. Then the other question we have from the community was about interview techniques. So we talked about, you gave us some tips, on how to tackle interviews. So what if you in face of a tough question you did not anticipate? What would your advice be, to wing it or to come out looking good still?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, I mean, my first piece of advice is prepare for the bad question, but there will be times when you are thrown the unexpected question.
Of both, yes.
Yes. There are a few techniques that you can use. One is blocking. It's called blocking and linking or bridging. I just did it with Johnny's question, actually. That's a really interesting question, Johnny. What I would say is, so you use a blocking phrase like, that's an interesting question, or, well, that's one viewpoint. What I would say, or what I'm here to discuss today, or, what I'd like to tell you about my company is XYZ. So a blocking and linking or a bridging phrase sort of stops the question in its track and allows you to move back to your messaging. Now, please go online, watch some of these. They're not so difficult to employ in practice, but you've got to be careful to not look like you're evading a journalist's question.
Yeah.
The second technique I'd use is something called zooming out. So Jack Ma is very, very good at this. So you'll see some Wall Street Journal interviews from about 5-6 years ago, and they say to him, Jack, how do you work with the Chinese government? And he zooms out by making the issue bigger than the Chinese government. So he says, well, when I work with any government, what I would say is you've got to be in love with the government, you don't marry the government. And so what he's done there is, instead of answering a question about the Chinese government, which we know now it's bad, is to make sure that he's made the issue a lot wider and he's been able to kind of move it away from a potentially tricky question.
I see.
The third point is, I would say, if it's something you actually can't answer, you don't know, please don't wing it. I would, much rather I see any clients I work with say, I'm afraid that's not something I'm able to discuss, or that's not my area of expertise. Rather than a no comment, if you can make it something a little bit softer than that, you can always refer back and say, actually, I'm not sure about that right now, but let me go away, do a bit of research, and I can come back to you with some thoughts later on. So if you're put on the spot, there are ways and means of getting out of that.
I see. That's good. So 3 tips from Emma: block it, zoom out, right?
Yes.
And the third is be honest.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. So we've got one question from the Q&A box. Any best practices you can share about ensuring employees align their social media messaging with their employer? Often for smaller startups, it's hard to distinguish between the company and the individual? So this is a pretty good question.
Absolutely. I'm just writing that down. So it's a really, really interesting question, because I think the line you need to draw here is it a company's personal, is it an employee's personal channel, or is it something where they are representing you as the company? So, you know, a good example of this is we were having a conversation internally about whether people needed to have professional WhatsApp photos or sort of like a headshot WhatsApp photo. And we were saying that we actually don't give professional sort of work phones anymore. So actually you're using your personal WhatsApp. So you're there in a kind of personal / professional capacity. And the lines are often quite blurred on these things as well. So my advice would be to look at the channels in question. If it's LinkedIn, yes, it should be, as relevant to the organization as possible, because you are there in a professional capacity. It is your job that is there as your headline. Going back to messaging, making sure you've got messaging around how you describe the company, any guidelines as well. So putting in place social guidelines on what employees should and shouldn't be commenting on. If there are, areas which are a bit interesting for you as a company, advising employees that you would like them not to comment on that is ideal. But as it pertains to, Instagram, Facebook, those are a little more tricky. But I would always ask employees to make their channels, if they've got strong views, if they're into something which doesn't quite align with your, your messaging or your outlook as a company, to make that private if they can. But it really is a case by case, an employee by employee basis as well. But guidelines for social media should be, your kind of starting point for having those conversations.
Okay, thank you for that. I hope that answers the question. I'm quite aware of the time. We have about 4 to 5 minutes left for the session. So I will just maybe have Emma answer one last question from the community. This is a question coming from startups who have no budget and I guess no budget to hire an agency or, comm specialists. I know you've shared a lot of tips and hacks during the presentation. Any other advice you have for this segment of fintech businesses?
Absolutely.
To tackle PR and comms?
Yeah, and I know when you are in those early stages and, if you're not at the seed or A round stage, it can be very, very challenging to have budget for PR and marketing as well. So I totally understand that. As I've mentioned during the session, there are loads of resources available online. Loads of PR companies, including Cognito, are out there giving advice on various, tips, tricks, techniques to help you, make your comm strategy really work for you. But there is so much you can do online, internally, without really needing that knowledge. So that audience mapping, the content mapping as well. It just needs you to sit down and really dedicate some time and some brain power to it. Combine that with some of the online resources, make friends with PR people, take them out for drinks. They'll always help you in the interim, but there's lots out there for companies who are in that situation.
Cool. Okay, thank you. I think we've come sort of close to the end of the session. Thank you, Emma, for preparing the presentation, taking time to share your insights and your use cases with us. I hope this is useful for everyone. I think, Emma, you've made available your contact.
Yes, I have.
Yeah, so if not, we'll share it post webinar. If you have further questions, any advice you need, please feel free to ping Emma on email. So I'd like to hand this session over to MJ.
Hi, okay, thanks Emma and Shu Fan. It was a very great presentation, and also thank you everyone. We appreciate you being here. If you're interested in more of such events, do keep a lookout for our weekly newsletter that has our upcoming events. So thank you again for joining today's webinar, which is also the last one for 2021, and we will see you again in 2022. Thank you.
Happy holidays.
Yes, happy holidays. Bye everyone.